To understand the scale of what Alexander the Great achieved, you have to understand the man who wrote about him. Arrian, writing in the 2nd century AD, nearly 400 years after the fact, wasn't interested in the gossip of the royal court or the romanticized myths that had begun to swirl around Alexander's life. Instead, he was a military man at heart. He wanted to know how the campaigns were won, how the sieges were laid, and how a small kingdom like Macedon managed to swallow the largest empire on earth. His work, the Anabasis of Alexander, is a journey up-country, moving from the coast of Asia Minor deep into the heart of the unknown. The title itself is a nod to the historian Xenophon, whom Arrian emulated in both style and structure. To piece this history together, Arrian relied on the lost journals of men who were actually there, most notably Ptolemy, a general who would later found a dynasty in Egypt, and Aristobulus, a military engineer. Because of these sources, Arrian's account is less of a personal biography and more of a rigorous military chronicle, balancing tactical detail with the sense that Alexander was driven by a divine, almost inevitable destiny. The story begins not with a conqueror, but with a young man standing in the shadow of his father, Philip II. When Philip was assassinated in 336 BC, the Macedonian throne was far from secure. Alexander had to prove himself immediately. He didn't just sit in the palace, he moved north, striking into Thrace and Illyria to crush rebellions and secure his borders. It was during these early years that we see the first glimpses of the tactical mind that would change history. In the mountains of Mount Haemus, he faced Thracian tribes who had set traps with heavy rolling wagons designed to crush infantry. Rather than a head-on assault, Alexander used speed and clever maneuvering to bypass the traps, proving that he wouldn't just fight his enemies, he would outthink them. Once his home was secure, Alexander turned his eyes toward Persia. The campaign began at the Granicus River in Asia Minor. This wasn't a slow, methodical march, it was a high-stakes gamble. Alexander led a heavy cavalry charge directly into the Persian lines, putting himself at the very tip of the spear. It was a moment of immense personal risk that paid off, breaking the Persian resistance and opening the gates to Asia. It is during these early stages that we encounter one of the most famous symbols of his reign, the Gordian knot. Legend says that whoever could untie the intricate knot was destined to rule all of Asia. Rather than spend hours picking at the fibers, Alexander drew his sword and sliced through it. It was a moment that perfectly captured his character, decisive, perhaps even impatient, and willing to ignore tradition in favor of a direct, forceful solution. As the campaign progressed, the conflict with the Persian king, Darius III, moved from skirmishes to total war at the Battle of Issus in 333 BC. Here, Alexander's tactical genius met the reality of Persian numbers. Even though Darius had a massive army, Alexander used the narrow terrain between the mountains and the sea to his advantage, preventing the Persians from using their superior numbers to outflank him. The Macedonian line held, and the Persian center broke. Darius was forced to flee the field, leaving behind his royal regalia and his family. Alexander didn't just take territory at Issus, he took the symbols of Persian legitimacy. But even after defeating Darius, Alexander realized that to truly control the empire, he had to control the sea. He couldn't leave the Persian fleet active behind him, as they could potentially cut off his supply lines or invade Greece. This realization led to the grueling and famous siege of Tyre in 332 BC. The Tyrians were masters of their island fortress, which seemed impregnable from the water. Alexander responded with one of the most audacious engineering feats of the ancient world. He built a massive mole, a land bridge, through the sea to reach their walls. It was a display of sheer logistical willpower. He didn't just fight battles, he reshaped the physical geography of the world to suit his needs. Following the fall of Tyre and Gaza, Alexander moved into Egypt. Unlike the Persians, who were seen as occupiers, the Egyptians welcomed him as a liberator. It was here that he visited the oracle of Zeus, Ammon, and founded the city of Alexandria, a jewel of the Mediterranean that would stand as a center of learning for centuries. But Alexander wasn't finished. His momentum carried him through the Levant and into the heart of the Persian Empire. He captured Babylon and Susa, seizing the massive Persian treasury and effectively becoming the master of the empire's core. The climax of his Persian campaign came at Gaugamela. Darius had gathered a massive, diverse army on an open plain, specifically designed to negate Alexander's advantages and allow the Persian cavalry to swarm him. But Alexander used a sophisticated wedge formation, driving a hole straight through the Persian center. The result was a total collapse of the Persian command structure. Darius fled once more, and this time there was no returning. Alexander was now the king of kings. However, the more Alexander conquered, the more his goals seemed to shift. He wasn't just a king anymore, he was becoming something else entirely. He began to adopt Persian customs, wearing their royal clothing and implementing a policy of fusion, encouraging his Macedonian officers to marry Persian noblewomen to create a unified ruling class. He even introduced the practice of proskinesis, the Persian custom of bowing or prostrating oneself before a ruler. This caused deep, simmering resentment among his veterans. To his soldiers, these weren't just new customs, they were a betrayal of the Macedonian way of life and an affront to their equality. This tension reached a breaking point as Alexander pushed into the rugged, unfamiliar territories of Central Asia and eventually into the Indus Valley. And the warfare here was different, unconventional, brutal, and fought in mountain passes and dense jungles. In India, he faced King Porus at the Hydaspes River. It was a terrifying battle involving war elephants, which the Macedonians had never encountered on such a scale. Through a brilliant flanking maneuver, Alexander won, but he didn't destroy Porus. Instead, he turned the defeated king into a loyal vassal, showing a level of political sophistication that matched his military talent. But even Alexander had limits. At the Hyphasis River in India, the army finally broke. They had been marching for years, fighting in heat and rain, through mountains and rivers. They were exhausted, and they were terrified of the unknown lands that lay further east. When Alexander tried to shame them into continuing, the men refused. The conqueror had finally met a force he could not command, the sheer physical and mental exhaustion of his own men. Forced to turn back, the return march was a test of leadership and endurance. While crossing the Gedrosian desert, Alexander demonstrated an almost legendary level of solidarity with his troops. When his men were dying of thirst, he famously refused to drink water that had been brought to him, choosing to suffer the same deprivation as the lowest soldier. It was a way to cement the bond between him and his men, but the cost was devastating. Thousands died in the sands of the Gedrosia, a reminder that nature could be more lethal than any Persian army. By the time Alexander returned to Babylon, the man who had set out to conquer the world was a shadow of the young king who had crossed the Hellespont. The court was a place of intense tension. He was increasingly seen as a god, a divine ruler, and his adoption of Eastern ways had created a chasm between him and his most loyal companions. One of the most tragic moments of this period was the death of Clitus, the Black, a veteran who had been a close friend but who became a vocal critic of Alexander's new, autocratic style. In a fit of rage during a drunken argument, Alexander killed him. It was a moment of profound personal and political loss, signaling that the bond between the king and his men had finally snapped. The end came swiftly, and without the grandiosity of his battles. In 323 BC, while in Babylon, Alexander fell ill with a sudden, raging fever. He died at the age of 32, leaving behind an empire that was massive in size but incredibly fragile in structure. He had conquered the known world, but he had not built a way to keep it together. When you look back at Arrian's account, you see more than just a list of battles. You see the paradox of Alexander's life. He was a master of logistics and engineering, a man who could move mountains and redirect rivers to win a siege. He was a brilliant tactician who understood how to use terrain to negate an enemy's strength. But he was also a man driven by a hunger for immortal glory that ultimately outpaced the human capacity of the men who followed him. There is a tension throughout the book between the Alexander of history, the general who moved with incredible speed and precision, and the Alexander of legend, the man who sought divinity and tried to fuse two different worlds into one. Arrian's work sits right in the middle of that tension. He gives us the facts of the march, the details of the wedge formation, and the mechanics of the siege, but he cannot ignore the aura of destiny that surrounded the man. In the end, Alexander's legacy wasn't just the empire he built, but the world he broke open. By tearing down the barriers between the Greek and Persian worlds, he created a new, hybrid culture that would define the Mediterranean and the Near East for centuries. He was a man who lived his life at a pace that the world wasn't quite ready for, leaving behind a trail of glory and destruction that we are still trying to untangle today.